I'm Ward Wilson. I'm a senior fellow at BASIC, a think tank on nuclear weapons. And I'd like you to come on a journey with me outside the box. Most thinking about nuclear weapons is trapped inside a box. It's framed by a conundrum that people can't seem to get away from. In a nuclear war, millions would die. They would mostly be innocent civilians. The death and destruction would be out of all proportion to the issue at stake that might have started the war. We should be able to get rid of them, but we can't. Why? Because they're necessary. Nuclear weapons have shown that they can win wars when no other weapon can. Nuclear weapons provide the foundation for nuclear deterrence, which is what keeps us safe. And even if we wanted to get rid of them, we can't. You can't disinvent nuclear weapons. Those who hope that morality holds the key to breaking free from this conundrum are bound to be disappointed, because in a crisis, necessity almost always trumps morality. People will say, yes, you're right, it's wrong, but we have to do it. 97 times out of 100, the strongest moral argument won't restrain the desire to use nuclear weapons in a crisis. So we're trapped. We hate nuclear weapons, we know they're immoral, but we feel we can't get rid of them. I've been thinking about nuclear weapons for 30 years, mostly without institutional support, outside of established conceptions, schools of thought, ideas. Instead of using a lot of the standard thinking that people use about nuclear weapons, I based a lot of what I thought on the thinking of this guy. This is William James, the founder of an American school of philosophy called pragmatism. Pragmatism disdains theory and abstraction and focuses instead on what impact something will have in the practical world of real effects. It's about what works. I'd like to take you on a journey. We won't talk about morality. We'll examine questions pragmatically. There'll be some history to begin with, but eventually we'll arrive at a relatively surprising policy implication. I hope it will help you to see the nuclear weapons conundrum in a new way. Our journey takes the form of 3 stories. The first is about a man who decides not to tell the truth with enormous consequences. The second is a story about group blindness and where that blindness came from. And the third is a story about people mistaking a tool for a genie. It's not easy to always tell the truth, particularly if you're the leader of a nation and feel that you're responsible for the welfare of that nation. Emperor Hirohito had been told since he was a small boy that he was responsible for the welfare of Japan, but he faced an insoluble problem. He was in the middle of a war that Japan was losing badly, in fact, had already lost, and yet the military refused to surrender. The military was powerful, radical, and single-minded, and by the end of the war, they were largely in control of the government. They believed, based on Japan's history, that a miracle last-minute victory was always possible, and in any event, their warrior code dictated that they could never surrender. They were deeply opposed to the idea of surrender. The emperor was not a dictator. He had influence, but not power. He was, if you can imagine, kind of a cross between the Queen of England and the Pope. A religious leader crossed with a ceremonial figurehead, head of state. So how could the emperor use that influence to persuade the military to surrender? Throughout the summer of 1945, they were deadlocked, with the American submarine blockade making the situation increasingly dire. Then, in the first week of August, a momentous event occurred which would change everything that came after, and which would allow the emperor finally to convince the military to agree to surrender. The week began badly on Monday with the destruction of another city by U.S. bombers, this time Hiroshima. The Americans claimed they'd used a new type of bomb called an atomic bomb and threatened a rain of ruin on other Japanese cities. For the most part, Japan's military leaders were not impressed. Kwabe Toroshiro, the deputy chief of staff of the army, wrote in his diary that it was an atomic attack on Hiroshima, but, he said, we must be tenacious and fight on. When Foreign Minister Togo suggested on Thursday that they have a meeting of the Supreme Council, then the ruling body of Japan, in order to discuss this new bombing of Hiroshima, this new weapon, the military on the Supreme Council said no. It wasn't a game changer. And it's easy to see why they said that. If you graph the 68 city attacks that occurred in the summer, that the U.S. unleashed on Japanese cities in the summer of 1945, you might imagine that Hiroshima would be here off the charts, because that's the way it's always presented, if you graph the number of people killed in each of those 68 attacks. But in fact, Hiroshima is second. Tokyo, a conventional attack, is first. If you graph the square miles destroyed, Hiroshima is sixth. If you graph the percentage of each city that was destroyed, Hiroshima is 17th. The bombing of Hiroshima was one more piece of bad news in a war that was already going badly. But it was not exceptional. It was not outside the parameters of attacks that had been going on all summer long. It did not change the strategic situation. Think about the soldiers dug in on the beach. After the bombing of Hiroshima, they could still fight. They were still ready to fight. There was one fewer city behind them. But they had been losing cities all summer long at the rate of one every other day. It may have been heartless for Japan's military leaders not to be impressed with the bombing of Hiroshima, but it certainly wasn't wrong in terms of military strategy. So they continued on with their work, meeting and discussing what to do, unaware that the event that was going to force the war to end was nearly upon them. The hammer fell on Thursday. The blow that gave Emperor Hirohito a way out and changed everything. Japanese leaders awoke on Thursday morning to find that the Soviet Union, which had been neutral, had declared war and invaded Manchuria, Sakhalin Island, and other territories. It was a game changer. The Soviet Union had been neutral. They'd signed a pact to run until 1946. Their decision to enter the war on August 8, 1945, fundamentally changed the structure of the war. Adding another great power created insoluble problems for Japan's leaders. It might be possible to fight hold off one great power attacking from one direction. But anyone could see that it would not be possible to fight against two great powers attacking from two different directions at once. The Soviet declaration of war fundamentally altered the strategic situation of the war. The Soviet entry into the war touched off a crisis. They held an emergency meeting of the Supreme Council on Thursday to discuss what they should do. But the military leaders were still not persuaded. They still couldn't quite bring themselves to surrender. If they surrendered, they would lose face. Their honor was at stake. It was then that someone in the close circle of advisors around the emperor had a bright idea. Why not say that Japan was surrendering not because of the Soviet Union, but because of the new atomic bomb that the Americans had used against them? No one could blame the military if they lost to a miracle weapon. Kida Koichi, one of the emperor's closest advisors, said, "If military leaders could convince themselves that they were defeated by the power of science, but not by lack of martial spirit or strategic errors, they could save face to some extent." And Sakamizu Hisatsuna, the chief cabinet secretary, said, "The atomic bomb was a golden opportunity given by heaven for Japan to end the war. It was in science that Japan was defeated, so the military did not bring shame on themselves by surrendering. In ending the war, the idea was to put the responsibility for defeat solely on the atomic bomb and not on the military. This was a clever pretext." So the military finally gave in, and the emperor went on radio and said that Japan had to surrender because of this new and most cruel bomb. Blaming defeat on the bomb made a terrific explanation for losing the war. It preserved the institution of the emperor and saved Japan from further destruction. If I had been the emperor, I'd have done the same thing. But actions have consequences. The emperor's misleading explanation for the surrender had enormous consequences. The United States came to believe that nuclear weapons really were miracle weapons. They convinced other countries that they were miracle weapons, and then other countries wanted those weapons too. Nuclear weapons became the currency of power. The emperor used nuclear weapons as an excuse for losing. He had to get the military to surrender. But at the same time, he inadvertently created the belief in the United States that nuclear weapons really were miracle weapons. But of course, the truth is, Japan's military leaders largely ignored the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's only been one field test of nuclear weapons, the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the lesson that we learned from that one field test is essentially exactly backwards. We learned that nuclear weapons matter a great deal. In fact, they hardly mattered at all. Nuclear weapons are not miracle weapons. They didn't force Japan to surrender. The emperor told a little white lie. And in the course of telling that little white lie, he inadvertently changed the course of history.